so I think part of it is that they have to feel safe. They have to feel that they're not being judged, they're not being evaluated for those kinds of questions.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. From Indonesia, selamat pagi. If you're from the Philippines, magandang mabuhay, everyone. And if you're from Java, let me greet you with a special greeting, Sugeng Enjang, which means good morning as well. Ladies and gentlemen, today's topic is really, really interesting and exciting. 21st century pedagogy, ways to develop an inquiring mind. I think I would agree with Professor Zul earlier on when he said that thinking skills have always been important in our life. It was important in the past, it is very important now, and it is also going to be extremely important in the future as well. It is important for you, it is important for me, it's important if for teachers, for teacher educators. Also, if you are graduate students, you need to be critical as well. If you are a scientist, you also need to be critical. If you are a parent, you also need to be critical as well. In today's world, kids, ask a lot of questions, and we need to guide them. We need to help them find, relevant information and also credible information, given the fact that information is so available and accessible nowadays to everyone in the world. And a lot of the time, the information can be credible, and sometimes or very often the information may not be very credible. I think we are reminded of the 4 C's of the 21st century skills: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and also creativity, the 4 C. And today we are going to discuss how all these C's are related, interrelated, and how our understanding of these 4 C's can help us, help our students and also help our children at home. We are also reminded of the 5th C. Another C which is extremely important is culture. We are happy to, I'm happy to say that later in the seminar, we'll have Ibu Amelia, who will be talking about how culture, how our way of doing things in our daily life can also influence the way we think, the way we communicate, the way we collaborate with other people, and how we become critical or not critical in our own culture. Let me just introduce the first speaker again. Professor Mark Baildon is currently Associate Dean of the Research Center of the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. He is also a senior member of staff from the Humanities and Social Studies Education Department. He has taught in many different places, including the USA, Singapore, Taiwan, and Israel as well. His research interests mainly are in the area of 21st century pedagogy and focusing on inquiry practices, global citizenship, education, and also global literacy practices. He has published a lot, including these 2 books, too many to mention. He will be sharing with us inquiry-based pedagogy. Let me just read. The role of questioning and scaffolding to teach critical thinking. He'll be talking about 20 minutes, and then I will ask him 1 or 2 questions before we move on to the next speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Mark Baildon. I think Mark is getting ready now. Yes, the screen is on. Yes, there you go. Mark, your voice, you are probably mute.
I just gave
Yes.
the first 5 minutes of my talk muted. Okay, so
Okay. Okay.
I'll start over, and
Thank you.
I'll put the timer on for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, selamat pagi and terima kasih. I want to thank the organizers of this webinar for giving me the opportunity to share some of my work and thinking. So as Willy mentioned, I'm going to talk about the role of inquiry-based pedagogy in the 21st century, and especially focus on how to develop an inquiry culture, inquiry mindset, by focusing on the role of questioning and scaffolding to teach critical thinking. Let me see if I can advance the slides now.
Yes.
So yeah, so I'm gonna focus on three basic questions. Why is inquiry-based pedagogy especially important in the 21st century, and what is the role of inquiry and critical thinking in the 21st century? I want to also focus on the what to kind of give you a sense of my view of inquiry and critical thinking, and then talk a little bit about the how. You know, how can we work as educators to develop inquiry cultures and mindsets? And I'm going to draw on a couple of publications. One Willy has already mentioned, which is a book that I wrote in 2011 with James D'Amico, who's a literacy educator at Indiana University, and that's titled Social Studies as New Literacies in a Global Society. And I have a new article coming out in the Asia Pacific Journal of Education, which is really a meta-synthesis of inquiry-based classroom practices for pedagogical innovation. So we did a synthesis of a range of research projects, mainly in the humanities and the arts. And so that's in press and should be coming out soon. So I'm going to draw on those two articles primarily. But what I'm going to talk about in terms of the role of inquiry and critical thinking is that I see it as very important for two particular problems that I think we face around the world. And most of my work has been an inquiry, actually, into these two particular problems. The first one is the challenge of understanding and addressing complex problems, such as climate change, pandemic, inequality, social injustice. The work that I'm doing now, again with James D'Amico, who's a literacy scholar at Indiana University, is focused on climate change literacy. And so we're looking at the issue of climate justice, how to help prepare teachers and students to better understand and address this as a complex socio-scientific problem. And then the second one is related to the challenge of navigating complex information systems and texts. And so I'll focus mainly on that second problem. My background is in social studies education, so we do focus on social issues, but I also do work in new literacies, and since you know, the Center for Language Development is organizing this webinar, I thought perhaps the second challenge would be the one that I would focus on the most. So if we look at complex information systems, you can look at it in terms of 4 V's, that we have a tremendous volume of information coming at us on a daily basis. If we have a phone, if we have a smartphone, we're able to access a range of information. So the volume, the variety of text, these are multimodal that Victor is going to be talking about in the second presentation. The speed at which we're getting new information on a daily basis, and the challenge of veracity, being able to tell whether these are accurate information sources. Nicholas Berbulis and Callister have labeled these as the 4 M's, that we receive a lot of misinformation, a lot of fake news, you know, we misinformation that's just completely inaccurate and is intended to, in some cases, misinform us as well. We also receive malinformation. This is harmful information. You might think of pornography, you might think of the grooming by different extremist organizations of young people. And then a lot of information is just messed up and really quite useless, actually. So we need some ways to be able to navigate these complex systems, because so much of what we know about the world comes to us through these complex information systems and texts. This is a quote by my professor at University of Rochester, Christopher Lash, who already in 1984 was saying that, you know, more and more we know about the world through these systems that produce quite a bit of misinformation. We might even call them misinformation systems to some extent. in Singapore, we're struggling with this like every place else, and we see, maybe you're familiar with a law that was passed last year, I believe it was, but it was the Protection Against Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, POFMA, and it's a similar kind of effort I think we see happening around the world, where I think nations and even organizations and companies and certainly schools are trying to think about how do we manage this information flow that really can result in, you know, swaying elections, really misinforming people. So we see some of these kinds of campaigns in different parts of the world, and I'm sure in Indonesia as well. When we talk about complex texts and we talk about literacy practices, we see that there's particular problems that are quite challenging for us. One is to discern the authorship of these sources. A lot of times we don't know where they're coming from or who's telling us this information. So there's a lack of vetting process with online information. Anyone can post websites and YouTube videos and tweet and so on. A lot of times credentials are quite difficult to determine. It's also quite challenging to discern the purposes of sources. Sometimes they're intended to misinform. So we have to be very careful in terms of really thinking critically about, you know, what's the purpose of this source? What is this person trying to do? Is it trying to persuade, trying to misinform? There's also complications regarding text structures. These are multimodal in many cases, so and Victor will talk more about this in the second presentation. There's challenges with language features, complex conventions. You know, sometimes the vocabulary is quite complex in terms of jargon, or maybe it's aimed at a scientific audience and it's not very accessible. And then there's some knowledge demands. It goes from the practical everyday to more specialized forms of knowledge. Sometimes they make allusions to different texts, and again with hyperlinking, they might connect to other kinds of texts. So you have to kind of think about what other texts are saying and how they help us think about particular issues. And then one of the knowledge demands is that we have very complex issues that are also quite difficult to understand. We know that language, stories, and images shape how we think about things. On the left-hand side, you can see an article that came out by National Geographic, where they basically admitted that they had perpetuated a range of stereotypes related to colonialism that were quite racist. On the right-hand side, that's a textbook in Hong Kong, actually, and you can see where Filipina is depicted as a domestic helper in Hong Kong. So the language that's used on a daily basis really shapes the ways we think about the world and the ways we think about others as well. So we have to be very careful and cautious in how we do this. And then adding to this is our own tendencies. We're prone to fast thinking, which Daniel Kahneman has written a very nice book around, fast thinking, slow thinking, that tends to be much more intuitive and emotional and is very biased as well. Instead of thinking that's more careful and deliberate or more disciplined, there's also issues around motivated reasoning, that we tend to look for information that actually confirms what we already believe. And we tend to disregard information that challenges what we believe. So there's a range of different biases that we're prone to. The other problem with fake news is that we're drawn to novelty. Fake news actually attracts much more attention and arouses stronger emotions than the truth. So people are able to use this to manipulate how we think about things. They're able to use these emotions, kind of play on the emotions of fear. We see this in the United States with Donald Trump, for example, playing on people's fears about either the left or about immigrants and so on. And what happens is that actually these systems of communication end up spreading falsehoods farther, deeper, and more broadly than the truth. So this is quite a challenge. And then we see again, you know, these effects where people cocoon themselves in what are called filter bubbles or, you know, echo chambers, where they only listen to people who have similar kinds of views. And this is a real problem. And so how do we address this? Well, I'm proposing that inquiry is one way to do that. And this is a very simple inquiry model. And there's critical thinking around texts involved in this, but it's around asking important questions. It's finding and evaluating evidence from relevant and trustworthy information sources, and then making informed conclusions that's based on evidence before we take action. So this is an inquiry model that can help us think through some of these kinds of issues and manage the complexity that I just shared. Dewey, of course, has written quite a bit about inquiry. He refers to it as a method of intelligence, that it's intelligence that is active, persistent, and careful, and is always looking for grounds to support the thinking and ideas that we have. And I think that it's important to see inquiry not just as something that solves problems, whether they're personal or societal, but it actually can result in self-actualization, the search for meaning and purpose at the individual level. And then self and societal transformation I see is quite linked. It's a way to not only address social problems, but also there's an imaginative or creative component to this around the search for beauty, search for good, search for justice. This is the Singapore Social Studies Inquiry Model that's been operationalized. You can see on the left that it's about inquiry into real-world issues, and it's designed to promote authentic learning experiences. This is a 4-phase model, and you can see that it's cyclical. It's helping, one of the aims is to try to spark students' curiosity about the world, get them to ask questions, to gather data and to gather reliable data, but also to exercise reasoning. Again, the critical thinking you can see plays a central role in each one of these phases. So this is on the left-hand side is a table where I try to highlight, and I'll be happy to share these slides. I try to highlight the types of critical thinking that we see in each of the phases of inquiry. So with sparking curiosity, obviously it's around problem formulation, being purposeful in one's thinking, questioning, to gathering data, which is really evaluating the reliability and credibility of information, to exercising reasoning, which is focused on getting multiple perspectives, multiple viewpoints, and making informed conclusions, and then reflective thinking, which is reflecting on both processes and knowledge. I love this quote by John Dewey that we need to be confronted with problems before we think. We only think when we are confronted with a problem. And so there's people in the social studies like Walter Parker who have advocated teaching with and for inquiry. Teaching with inquiry is really using inquiry to help students learn. Inquiry is a constructivist model of learning for students. It's something that can be used to help students build their own knowledge and develop understanding. Teaching for inquiry goes back to that idea of inquiry as a method of intelligence. Teaching for inquiry means that you're helping them develop thinking skills. So I'm going to move now to thinking about the how. How can we develop inquiry cultures and mindsets? And I'd like to ask you to think about these images a little bit. I think Amelia will talk more about this, but are these examples of inquiry? What makes it inquiry? What do we see people learning? And what I'd like to propose is a socio-cultural model of thinking and inquiry, that we learn how to think as a social practice with others. And sometimes you can see the role of mentors in this. I used to work as if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you see a counselor talking to perhaps a patient. And I used to work as a counselor, and sometimes we need to talk through our problems, to kind of, listen to kind of that process of talking and having someone that can kind of guide and help and facilitate thinking is really key here. And I'm hoping Amelia will also pick up on this later during her presentation. So what does this look like in classrooms? The psychologist William James called it a blooming buzz. There's a buzz in the classroom where students are talking to each other, asking questions, teachers are listening, they're modeling and giving feedback. There's a bit of a buzz and excitement in the classroom. We can see and kind of feel the sense of curiosity and wonder where, again, it's a classroom full of questions and questioning. If we think about scaffolding inquiry and critical thinking, one key thing that I'd like to highlight is asking strategic questions. Really being a very good questioner is a skill that I think we have to develop as both researchers, but certainly as educators as well. Barry Beyer has done some work around this and has, based on research, and it suggests that we need to explicitly teach step-by-step strategies. We need to model thinking in classrooms. In other words, we need to make thinking visible. You know, teaching step-by-step strategies makes the thinking process visible. Modeling it makes it visible. Guided practice means that students are doing authentic work where they're having to think. And then, of course, it requires a lot of supportive coaching and feedback, and then opportunity for practice and transfer, you know, like into new problems where they can apply what they've learned and apply their thinking to actual new problems that they're confronted with. And then it's important to adjust the scaffolding. So we talk about differentiated instruction quite a bit, that, you know, as learners become more versatile in their thinking, we reduce the scaffolding. They don't need the scaffolding. We can remove it when they become more developed in their thinking. So just to highlight some of this, activating prior knowledge is important. It's starting with where people are, what their experiences are, what they already know about a topic, and then really thinking about how do I activate that? How do I leverage that to help them learn new ideas? But we need to also continually work to motivate, and sometimes we can do that with interesting prompts or stimuli. The modeling and demonstrating is important. Again, I think, you know, it's important for students to see us as inquirers and critical thinkers in classrooms by asking a lot of questions, wondering about things, probing students. You know, what do you mean by that? Why do you say that? Why do you think that? What are the reasons that you have? So again, modeling that curiosity and questioning spirit, I think, is key. And then, of course, there's scaffolding around the use of graphic organizers to help people organize their thinking. But again, providing the feedback is important. And sometimes that's a matter of asking questions, maybe clarifying questions or probing questions. And that requires a facilitator, kind of a guide on the side. I think one key aspect of this is developing really good inquiry questions. They should be relevant to students. They should enable authentic intellectual tasks. And so here are some examples. There can be big questions, big issues like, what is justice? What does justice mean to you? What might justice look like in the Black Lives Matter movement, for example? They can be very personal too. What does it mean? I think I'm very interested in this issue of social responsibility. What does it mean for me to be socially responsible during the coronavirus? What does that look like? But it can be analytical, it can call for judgment, pose different kinds of problems, and it can be comparative as well. So I tried to provide a few examples that came to mind there as well. But starting with really good, meaty problems is, I think, or questions is a key here. I won't spend time on this, but this is something that's a bit of a guide for thinking about planning for inquiry in terms of thinking about how do I spark that curiosity? How do I make sure students are being exposed to different perspectives? How do I make sure that I can guide the students in terms of scaffolding as they go through the inquiry? And then are there opportunities to share findings in different ways, maybe through art or through written kinds of, or maybe even using technology? These are some lenses I'll very quickly talk. These are from the book that James and I wrote, where we talk about this need to really ask critical questions about texts, about what does the author want me to think, believe, value, or do, to think about the views represented as well as missing and different kinds of techniques. But there's also a reflective or reflexive component to this. We need to think more about, why am I connecting to this particular text? What affects the way I read it? Are there other ways to read this? And a lot of times that has to do, again, with culture and our backgrounds. But how might other people read this too? Are there other ways to read this text? And we think that's a very important aspect. Now, this is from a study in my wife's classroom at the Singapore American School, where we looked at her students struggling with some of these same kinds of issues around information. And she did this with her students. She asked them, you know, how can we make sure that we're using only trustworthy and reliable information? And together they developed a set of criteria that help them focus on the readability of text, the trustworthiness of text, and the usefulness of text. And again, I think what we highlighted here is that this was a form of public reasoning. It was reasoning together to develop criteria. Whoops, that's my timer there. I was trying to keep, I'm pretty close. Okay, so I'll take one more minute. And we see that there's this back and forth, an ongoing dialogue and deliberation with our students to really say, do we trust this source? Should we trust this source? Why or why not? What is it? What is it that bothers you about this? Is this actually useful for our inquiry? And so again, it's this idea of making thinking visible and making sure that they have a lot of practice and then coaching and feedback. So the last thing is from the article, we concluded in a very similar fashion that inquiry needs to be experiential. It needs to be social and collaborative in terms of this public reasoning and collective sense making around problems and texts. And it has to be authentic and meaningful and immersive, and it has to be engaging for both teachers and students. It should be something that excites people to kind of really think through things. And I think here's some references, and thank you very much. I'm finished. Thanks. And I think Willy's going to have some questions for me, so I'll stop sharing. Yeah. And now, Willy, you're muted. So even
yes, thank you. Yes, that was very, very insightful, Mark. Thank you so much for providing a big overview on criticality, on how we can help students develop an inquiring mind. I think you mentioned a lot about questioning, asking questions. That would be the first thing that we need to do, or our students need to do, in order to start actually thinking, becoming curious and stuff like that. In your experience as a teacher educator, how easy or how difficult it is to get students to ask questions? Teachers do ask a lot of questions. Students don't. I know the culture here in this part of the world. So what has been your experience in getting students to start asking questions?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I experienced that when I went from the United States to Taiwan. And in Taiwan, my students, I had secondary students, about 14 or 15. And in the United States, I had no problem with students asking questions. Sometimes it was difficult to get them to be quiet, to listen to other. But in Taiwan, I found, it was a real challenge for me. It was a real struggle to encourage that kind of questioning. And so I think, one of the things that I've tried to do is, really try to develop a very safe and kind of open environment. And I think, encouraging students to ask questions and sometimes it's around what they wonder about or, so I think part of it is that they have to feel safe. They have to feel that they're not being judged, they're not being evaluated for those kinds of questions. And I think that it's quite challenging. But I find that in Singapore in particular, I find that students, especially adults, are really good at questioning now. And I think in the Singapore culture we see that there's been this kind of shift. And I think I started working in Singapore in 2006. And as soon as I arrived in Singapore, I taught a master's course. And I remember the teacher saying, we have no experience with inquiry in our own lives. Yes. In the courses that we've taken as students, we never had much opportunity to ask questions. So this is new to us. And so I think it's a recognition that this is something it takes some time. And like anything else, it takes practice.
Yes.
And that people have to develop some confidence to be able to ask good questions. But I think if you make it a focal point of your instruction and you can provide criteria to help people think about questions and there's different kinds of questions, I think it can be fostered. Yeah.
Okay, a related question. This is a question about pedagogy. Do you think we should, create a new course, a standalone course called critical thinking course, or do you think it's much more efficient to just try to get everyone, on the faculty to sort of infuse critical thinking components in their teaching? What are the pluses and minuses?
Well, I think that it might be necessary at first to have an independent standalone course. I would prefer that not be the path necessarily, but I think that sometimes people need to see what this looks like in action. So maybe it provides a model for how it can look. But I do think that people have to think about something. And so having content in the different courses is very important. And I think to build a culture of inquiry and critical thinking, it's best if it's across curriculum and across subjects. And so it requires a lot of, I think, professional development at the university level to try to foster that culture so that it focuses more on problem formulation, how to ask good questions. It can be quite challenging, I think, for a full organization or university. So it may be best to take some initial steps, like by having a couple of courses kind of sequenced in a way that help both faculty and students, better understand what this might look like in practice, and then maybe spread out to a whole faculty. And then, we're, as university lecturers, sometimes it's difficult for us sometimes to let go of, being the center and kind of lecturing and so on. And so it's also a challenge, I think. Yeah.
Yes. And a great place for a PD courses or for a PD course will be Singapore NIE. So let's invite people to come to NIE, and we'll be happy to organize a thinking course, for people to learn a bit more about, critical thinking, pedagogy.
Just before the coronavirus, we had a nice group from Cambodia that came in for, I think over a month. And I worked with a group in the humanities for about a week, and it was focused on constructivist teacher education and inquiry-based teacher education. So I think there's those kinds of opportunities. We also have a conference in March now that is coming up. Since you're plugging things, I'll make a case. I'll send out some information to the organizers, and we can distribute that. But that's how Inda came to Singapore, and I met her at that conference as well. So now she's a PhD student there. Yeah.
Just one last point that you could probably elaborate. You mentioned about the book by Kahneman on fast thinking and slow thinking, or thinking fast and thinking slow. If I remember correctly from reading that book, I think people have the tendency to think fast, the kind of thinking that is intuitive, that is spontaneous. So reflective thinking, critical thinking requires a lot of slow thinking mode. So is it not a bit unnatural for people to be reflective all the time?
It's very unnatural, I think. I think it has to be a cultivated skill, actually, and that's what I think the role of educators is to help people slow down their thinking, to be more active in their thinking, more careful in their thinking, more persistent. And I saw Deli, I think her name was Deli, she had a question that popped up, and she said that her students lack the self-esteem or confidence, but that she's pretty convinced that they're thinking internally. And I think that is the case. I tend to be an introvert, and my son is an introvert, and I know that he's also shared that, he's thinking when problems are posed, and then there's questions, and he's listening to the discussion. And so sometimes we have to accommodate different kinds of learners and recognize, but I think there's some strategies, like maybe just getting them to write down their thoughts, write down their initial ideas, and then maybe calling on them. And then they can refer to their notes or what they've written. So there's other ways that we can, I found that when I was in Taiwan, that the boys who were reluctant to participate and to share their thinking, when I moved discussion online, then all of a sudden I saw these boys, all of a sudden wanting to participate, and the girls less so, which was kind of interesting. So I think there's issues like that to kind of think through too.
Yes, great ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, please clap for Professor Mark Baildon.
Deafening silence. I don't know. It's okay. Thank you, Willy. Okay.